You bet. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Younts. I'm the superintendent of the Mill River Unified Union School District, and I serve as the president of the Vermont Superintendents Association. I'm grateful to be with you today and helping to moderate this panel. And I think we need to start by acknowledging Peter Burrows. You know, as the president-elect of the VSA, one of his responsibilities is to provide levity. And so the Alvin and the Chipmunks imitation was outstanding earlier. And Peter, we're grateful. You're doing a bang-up job. So as we get going, before we get started, I'd like to introduce the sponsor of this session, Nicole O'Brien from ENA. Nicole, welcome.
Here.
Just to confirm, are we expecting Nicole to pop on? We'll wait a couple more seconds and then I'll keep plugging along if that's okay. All right, moving forward. Thanks again to everybody for joining us for this second workshop for today's conference. This workshop is entitled Education Legislation During a Pandemic. Today we have a number of esteemed panelists joining us as they reflect on legislating and leading during the pandemic and discuss their vision, goals, and outlook on the future of Vermont's public schools for the near and long-term future. So once again, the earlier session was about finance in many ways, and this session is focused on the way that our statewide leaders are thinking as we work our way through this crisis. First, we're joined by Representative Janet Ansell. She's the chair of the House Committee on Ways and Means, currently serves on the Joint Fiscal Committee, and has served on the Health Reform Oversight and Joint Legislative Management Committees. She served for many years as legal staff for the legislature and later as legal counsel to Governor Howard Dean, as well as being the Vermont Tax Commissioner. I'm sorry, legal counsel to the Vermont Tax Commissioner.
Yeah.
We're also joined by Senator Ann Cummings, chair of the Senate Committee on Finance, and she also serves on the Senate Committee on Ethics and the Senate Committee on Health and Welfare and the Health Reform Oversight Committee. Ann is the former mayor of Montpelier and is on the board of directors for the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, otherwise known as VSAC. Dan French is the secretary of the Agency of Education. His career in education has included the positions of high school social studies teacher, K-12 principal, and superintendent, earning the recognition of Vermont Superintendent of the Year in 2009. Prior to his appointment as secretary, Dan served as president of the Vermont Superintendents Association and as the coordinator of the School Leadership Graduate Program at St. Michael's College, where he taught graduate courses in school leadership, the legal and financial management of schools, and using data to improve schools. I'll go ahead and introduce Senator Debbie Ingram. Hopefully she's able to join us shortly. Debbie Ingram is the
She's joining us, yes.
Excellent. Debbie Ingram is the vice chair of the Senate Committee on Education. She also serves as the clerk for the Senate Committee on Health and Welfare, chairs the Advisory Council on Child Poverty and Strengthening Families, and sits on the Senate Work Group on Transition Challenges and the Vermont Child Poverty Council. Senator Ingram is the executive director of Vermont Interfaith Action, which seeks to effect systemic change around issues of social justice. Also, we're joined by Representative Kate Webb. Representative Webb is the chair of the House Committee on Education, serves on the Adverse Child Experiences Working Group. Kate was previously a special education case manager and speech language pathologist in Vermont schools and was a UVM clinical professor supervising graduate interns in practicum placements. So once again, welcome to all of our panelists. We are grateful to have you here with us today. In the first portion of today's workshop, which will be about 45 minutes long, I will be moderating an interview with the panelists. If questions emerge during this interview portion, please type them into the question feature of the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. Once again, type those into the question feature. If your question is directed to a particular panelist, please indicate as such. So we'll start out with just a global question for all of our panelists. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, as you think back about our experience over the past several months from February and March to current day. If you were to provide kind of the quick snapshot executive summary about what your experience in this pandemic has been like as a statewide leader, how would you capture that for us? If it's okay, Senator Cummings, could we begin with you?
Okay. I think it was like trying to find your way somewhere without a roadmap. I know Janet and I have both been through a few of the economic downturns. They come with some regularity, and there's a roadmap for that. There's been enough so the economists can tell us, well, it'll go this far and then it'll start coming up, but you have a roadmap. This one, we still don't have a roadmap for. We don't know what this virus is going to do. The only thing we've got close is the flu epidemic of 1918. So we still don't know. So we are still finding our way through this very strange new world, and we don't really have any guidance. So we're learning as we go. And I think to me, has been very helpful because Janet and I were both on the previous webinar or session to be able to have these conversations with the education community, because you're also going through a strange new world without a map. And the more we talk, the better we're gonna find our way through it, and come out at the other end still speaking. So I think that's an important lesson that I'm taking away from this.
Excellent. Thank you for that perspective, Ann. Representative Ansel, you were referenced. So, like a debate, since you were referenced, we'll give you your chance. So, how would you describe your experience?
Well, I think Ann is right that there certainly was no roadmap to sort of the economy, the kinds of challenges that we were facing in terms of decisions that we needed to make. But the other thing is that there was no roadmap on how to legislate. We were always in the building, and being in the building meant that we had little quick conversations down the hall from each other, and we could solve problems sometimes with 3 words in the hallway, and all of that was missing. And so I've thought about it some. One of the things that one of the pluses, I think, to the situation that we're in is that we very quickly realized that one of the things that we could do much more easily now than in the past was to meet jointly. Used to be we had to find a room and had to schedule it, and we had to find a place where everybody could sit and people could ask questions. And because we can do it on Zoom, I ended up having meetings sometimes with Kate's committee, occasionally with Ann's committee, also the appropriations committee with Katie Toll. Sometimes we got all 3 committees together. And that actually facilitated communication that was much more difficult in the past. So there have been pluses and minuses. I will speak for myself. I can't wait to get back in the building. I also understand that may not happen right away. So we're going to continue trying to work the way we are.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Quick housekeeping first. Welcome to Senator Ingram. We're glad to have you. And to the panelists, if you don't mind, if we can mute ourselves when we're not speaking, that would probably just help our background effects. Technology is wonderful, but we have to manage it as always. So Debbie, I'll come to you in just a little bit so that you can catch up with where we are. But the question that folks are talking about is just kind of an executive summary of their experience in this COVID world from March until now. So I'll come back to you in just a few, folks. Representative Webb, how would you describe your experience over the recent months?
Thank you. To go back to the road image, it was kind of like, at times it was like being in front of the snowplow and the snowplow didn't know where it was going, or on the back of the bus and no one was driving. So that was sometimes the way we experienced it. I totally concur with Representative Ansel that the amount of work that's done in the hall the ability to check in with legal counsel, to check in with the Joint Fiscal Office, to quickly ask another chair something, to check into the Speaker's office, to look at the faces of your advocacy when someone was testifying. We lost that, and that was hard. We did, however, I was able to send committee members easily to Representative Ansell's committee. I was also able to watch committee meetings of other committees that were related to educational issues. And here's the trick I learned. When you're watching on YouTube, do it in double time. You can get through much more quickly. and so that part is great. But I think probably one of the most profound things that I think we all saw was the glaring picture of what inequity looks like. And if you want to see what inequity looks like for children, close school buildings. And almost immediately we saw the lines drawn between the haves and have-nots, be it in broadband technology or economic stability or home stability or need for specialized learning. That the need for us to be addressing equity was in our faces constantly.
I did the mute cue and forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Kate. Appreciate that. Secretary French, how about you? How would you describe the narrative of the last several months for you?
Yeah, good morning. I think the first, phase of this experience could be described as an emergency response, and all that would entail. I've never been in state government during an emergency, so there was a lot of new learning for me in that regard, and certainly had no experience working under an emergency or executive order construct, so that was all new. And I would say the emergency period for me was really right up through mid-May to a large extent. So I'm not just talking about March, I'm talking all through April and May. Really, as we, as you know, had the milestone in the governor's order to develop guidance for graduation and end of year. I mean, it seems like we've been in this forever, but it's, I think, important. You asked me to reflect that we've really been in an emergency status right up and through, a month or so ago. I think it's only with, the improvement of our health conditions that we bought some time to do the planning, which is sort of the second phase, I would say. But, in terms of the emergency response, the rapidity of which decisions were being made, the rapidity of communications. So I certainly had to redesign my personal communication workflow to keep my head above water, so to speak. And then when the stay home, stay safe order was implemented, we dispersed the entire agency organization. So our apparatus was immediately dispersed. So at the same time, we're trying to design sort of, new regulatory construct. We also had to figure out how to work together in a remote space, which was somewhat challenging. I think, as we turn into it, there's a lot of new learning, as everyone's pointed to, lack of a roadmap or what have you. I've certainly gained more fluency in public health issues than I ever thought. I was thinking the other day about, you mentioned I was a superintendent. I was reflecting, yes, I still have a superintendent's license. I wonder when that's going to come up for renewal. I'm wondering if I could document my learning in public health as some of my professional learning hours, because I've really enjoyed, in spite of the incredible dynamism around this, I've really enjoyed learning from my public health colleagues a lot about what they do and grown to admire and have confidence in their work. So there's been, there's some positive aspects to it too, but it's been a very dynamic and challenging, certainly from a communications perspective, very challenging time.
Dan, I have some friends on the licensing board, so we can look into what the dynamics around that might be. Senator Ingram, would love to hear from you. What's your assessment of the last several months and your experience?
Thank you, David. My apologies for being late. I was having technical problems, but some of the VSBA staff helped me out, so appreciate that. And that's actually a very common theme. I think that our switch to using technology. I actually had used Zoom quite a bit in my other work running a nonprofit, but switching everything to doing things remotely was a challenge. But I think, the hardest part was along the Senator Cummings. I'm on health and welfare, and we, really wanted to try to help Vermonters and address the challenges that our healthcare providers were facing, immediately. So that involves quite a lot of time meeting together and hearing testimony and making changes. And then, of course, the difficulties facing our schools, our educators, our children, all of that. It's a great honor to be in a position to make some of these decisions to help folks, but it also was very draining, and my heart really goes out to the people who had to wait around for their unemployment insurance payments, the families who've been really facing challenges of being at home together, parents trying to help their children learn remotely. It has been very, very challenging, and I appreciate the opportunity as a legislator to be able to try to help folks. But it really goes down to everybody. It was a challenging time.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that perspective. The next question I'd like to ask the group is primarily targeted towards the legislators. So, Secretary French, you get to take this one off. We all work hard all the time, and on March 12th and 13th, we were all working hard on different things, and then the world changed, and our focus really turned to safety and finance and how to operate schools remotely, et cetera. So a lot of things got pushed to the back burner. I'd like to ask our legislators, are there any of those back burner topics that had importance in January, February, and March that got put aside that you see reemerging either in the August session or the when the next session opens? What do you see on the horizon in terms of the other work that you've been engaged in? Why don't we start with Janet? Would you mind getting us started?
Two of the issues that we worked on in the House that haven't made it to the finish line yet are changes to Act 250 in climate change legislation, and those are two pretty significant pieces that I'd love to see final action on. In the education world, we did a fair amount of work on a school construction bill that would have sort of set a process in place for getting our arms around some of the school construction needs, which are complicated, obviously, by the pandemic. And that didn't even make it out of the House. I think it ended up in the House Appropriations Committee. It's a complicated bill, partly because we were trying to use federal money and there's a time limit, and anyway, various complications around it. But that's a piece that I'd like to see some movement on. And when the others speak, I'll think of three more, but I can't think of them right now.
You bet, understood. Kate, how about you? What's on your mind in terms of back burner issues?
Yes, we had just sent that construction bill over to Ways and Means right before we left, and we were very excited about that. That was back when we actually had reserve funds. And the concern really about this has to do with right now, the different school districts are able to bond for school construction, and this does show up in the ed fund in an inequitable manner. So if you can get your voters to vote, you can bond, and if you can't, which is a real challenge. I have been in touch with Representative Welch's, Congressman Welch's office. He is actually, I believe, this week up in the Northeast Kingdom looking at some of the challenges that they're facing, because it's pretty far down the road of people that need some help. And there were two other bills that we had worked quite hard on that we had passed out of committee before we broke. One was a literacy bill, and we were putting money into professional development and coordination of early literacy as part of an implementation of Act 173. This, I believe, is in appropriations and will not move this year. The other was a pre-K bill. We had worked to remove the Agency of Human Services, the oversight for public schools. We're trying to separate those. And in addition, we were looking to provide regional coordination, which is one of the key drivers of the most successful pre-K regions. That ended up basically dying on the wall up in human services. So I don't expect any of those to move this year. There was another bill that came over from the Senate that we did not have a chance to look at, and that is the changing role of the State Board of Education. When we moved the commissioner position to an agency, there are a number of things that need to change in statute related to the relationship between the State Board of Education and the agency. So I expect that we will be looking at that in January.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Debbie, how about we go to you? What are your thoughts on back burner issues?
Thank you. Well, I agree with what my colleagues have said, already. Climate change, Act 250, definitely top of mind when we go back. And then Representative Webb has already covered really the bills pending before education. Structured literacy was one that I especially worked on and had introduced a version of that bill in the Senate. But I think one that really jumps to mind, especially given what's been going on with our law enforcement, is we have a bill on health and welfare to embed, to create this mobile mental health crisis response team in Rutland. And I think that kind of thing is going to be increasingly important as we talk about the role of our police and making sure that we begin to incorporate mental health experts and substance use disorder counselors and social workers more in how we respond to crises that have in the past only been responded to by police. So I think that model that we were working on is something that we want to return to and want to replicate in other parts of the state as well.
Thank you, Debbie. And Anne, how about you? What are your thoughts? Oh, we got you on mute, Anne. Sorry about that. Still don't quite have you.
Okay, I'm
Perfect.
unmuted. All
Good,
right.
good.
Every year there seems to be an issue that, at least in the public mind, is the issue of the year. A couple of years ago it was gun control, then it was money for clean water. This year it was global warming. That was a real focus, and it should be a real focus. We did finally get the Global Warming Solutions Act voted like the last few days before we recessed this year, and I haven't heard what its fate was. But there are other things. Finance spent a long time on a renewable energy bill, trying to strike that balance between requiring more renewable energy and also making sure that in the process we don't raise the cost to the point where people can't afford to buy things like electric cars or electric heat that we would like them to do, or heat pumps. So that's going to be with us for a while. I think that's a focus I'd like to see us work on. Finance did some technical changes to the TIF legislation. We found there was an audit of the St. Albans tax increment financing districts, for anyone that's not overly into that field. There was an audit, and there were some unclarities unearthed, and we do have a bill. I think we got it out the last couple days and sent it to the House that just cleared up what the legislative intent is in those sections so that we can avoid issues in the future. I think after that, we're going to be looking at how do we rebuild our economy, what's happening to our economy. We're always looking at the tax credits, incentives, things that are out there. I'm sure that's going to come back as we take a look at our economy as it starts to reform and rebuild once this crisis is over. and we'll be looking for a way to help stimulate that.
Much appreciated, Ann. Thank you. I guess a piggyback question for our legislators and anybody that wants to answer this. If you have an answer, you're welcome. I know that superintendents are curious about whether the legislature will return to in-person sessions at some point in time. Do you have any sense on when or if that is slated to occur?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
I would like anything. I mean, I'd like that more than anything. I think we do better work, and I think we can do it more efficiently, and it allows the public a sort of the more familiar way of participating. But it's a small building, and particularly in the House, our committee rooms are tiny. And I just don't see how you can do, even with masks, how you can do it safely. I hope things that we're looking at are alternate spaces. An idea that I've thrown out there that hasn't really caught on yet is to meet and then adjourn for a period of time, so that there's time for a vaccine to be implemented, to be developed and deployed. But I think the reality is that at least a good part of what we do is going to be remote. Certainly in August, it's going to be remote, and I think probably in January.
Yeah, understood. And Janet, I appreciate that candid answer. It probably won't surprise you that those of us who are working to open schools, those are the exact issues that we're looking at, and the dynamics are front and center for all of us. So thanks for being there for us on that. Dan, I'd like to turn to you for kind of a question about how the agency can intersect with the legislature around data. So, when we think about public policy being formed legislatively around equity in particular, when we think about race, economics, gender, all the different pieces, language that might go into that, how do you see the agency best functioning to provide legislators with what they need informationally to develop good public policy that promotes a more equitable system in Vermont? You have 90 seconds, go.
Yeah, I think it's an important consideration. I forget who observed, I think it was Senator Cummings, there's always a public issue, and I think an essential element of good policy is data, particularly, to the issue Representative Webb acknowledged that we have a diverse landscape in education, and there had been persistent equity issues across the state that have largely been identified through data. So, in particularly addressing the issues of equity and solid service delivery in all regions of the state, I think data is a critical piece. So, it's something I think is a work in progress for those who have been consumers of the agency's data over the years, as I have as well. We've, part of it is we've had a legacy system. So how do we, sort of make new tools while we're working with old tools, kind of issue. And then, of course, we've had some federal investment in the state longitudinal data system and so forth, and some strategies that have been taking years to bring online. So we're working our way out of that. I think, one of the things we're doing at the agency, which has been helpful, which will pay off over time, is, we organized a data division, because we really think data is a core function of the agency's work. And previously, a lot of those data roles were decentralized and embedded in various teams. So to bring them all together in one place has been really useful. But we have some work to do in this area, and I'm particularly interested in ensuring that what we do at the state level isn't overly complex for the scale of our state. We have so few students in a very rural area, so we have to be always cognizant not only on the utility of the information, the data, but also to what extent can we easily maintain those systems at the state level. So there has to be a balance, I think, between the need and the use, which helps drive it, but we also have to be very careful about making investments that we cannot handle due to their complexity or interference with other systems. So I think we're on the right path, but it'll take several years, honestly, to build our way out of that.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that response. Dan, I think I'd like to add another question for you, but also layer Kate and Debbie into this. So, and this is due to Kate and Debbie, your roles on education committees. So for the three of you, vision for the future. We all hope and believe that we are going to emerge from this COVID woods at some point in the hopefully more near future than distant future, but we will emerge. And in leadership roles, we're always looking down the road, like, where do we want to be? So I'd love your perspective on 5 years out. Where would you like to see Vermont education? And I think in a previous session, you mentioned kind of reimagining the educational delivery models, and this is our opportunity. So what do you have to say? Dan, why don't we start with you, and then Debbie and Kate, just as a matter of sequence.
Yeah, I think, irrespective of the COVID context, I think we can acknowledge that we're into sort of worldwide revolution around education that's really expanding learning opportunities for students. So we have the curriculum, as defined, is expanding rapidly due to technology. So what can be taught in schools is changing, and where it can be taught obviously is changing as well. But we're also now, with some new tools, being able to really focus the system on the individual, which I would argue is something that's always been our goal in Vermont education, going back 100 years or so, and progressive ideals. So we have that goal in front of us. The question is, defining what is that high quality. Sometimes we use the phrase world-class education, and then making sure our commitment remains on each individual ability to achieve that, the equity piece. So we, as a laudable, I think, goal, Vermont could be poised to really see that enacted, which has been part of our challenge. I think as a state, we've talked a lot about that over the years, but we have structures and systems from another century that really inhibit us enacting that. And we love those systems, so we're not anxious necessarily to let go of them. But it's a question of how, particularly in this moment in time with COVID, which arguably is once in a lifetime or very unique historical experience, shall we say, for our country and its economy, especially considering the influence of technology on remote learning and so forth. So the question is, as much as we're responding to the day-to-day emergency response kind of topics and preparing for the fall, will we also have the capacity to surface the strategic opportunities to enact our ideals? So I think, this issue of hybrid learning in particular that we're putting on the table last week and now as we plan for the fall, I think will have long sort of repercussions for the structure of the system. I'm not sure yet what that means, but I think it's allowing us to simultaneously expose equity issues and really try to focus on remediating infrastructure issues or systems issues where those equity service delivery gaps exist. But it's also allowing us to focus more on those students that their needs aren't being met. So, for example, I saw pretty quickly in the remote learning that was occurring in April, students reaching out to those students that really weren't connected, and they were spending a lot more time on those individual students, where I would say previously, having spent 20 years of my life in schools, we come back to the routine on Monday morning, irrespective of where individual students might or might not be. And we certainly have our focus on educational support teams and so forth. But I think, we have the ability, I think, potentially to design that more emphatically into the system to ensure that we are monitoring individual student progress and engagement and their goals of reaching their learning aspirations, and ensuring that the system responds accordingly when they need additional help to do that.
Thank you, Dan. Debbie, how about you? What's your view and vision for what you'd like to see for Vermont education 5 years out?
I think just in terms of delivery of education, there will be a hybrid approach between remote learning and in-person learning, which I think a lot of that, of course, has been instigated by the pandemic, but we were probably headed toward that in some fashion before, and so it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But I'm particularly interested in some of the approaches to learning that we've been looking at and expanding on that. I think proficiency-based learning and the personalized learning plans will become ever more important in how we treat individual students, and helping our educators to embrace those approaches and to make them work well for individual situations in schools. There have been, we took testimony earlier in the year about some concerns around proficiency-based learning. So those need to be worked out. But I think by and large, that approach is really excellent, and will serve our students well, and in long run be very good for our educators too. And as I look at what's going on in our country, I'm very hopeful that our education system is so good in Vermont I would love to see an emphasis on teaching all of our kids at different age levels critical thinking skills. I think the kind of irony of the fact that we have all this social media and so much information nowadays is that it's difficult to sift through what is real and what is fake, especially when we have a chief executive who talks constantly about poo-pooing information that is actually scientific or that is accurate and calling it inaccurate. And I think we really now more than ever need to make sure that we're helping our students as they're progressing through grades, really be able to discern for themselves what's true and what's accurate and what's not. That's really going to be a part of being a citizen of the United States and of the world as we go forward. So I'm excited that I'm sure Vermont educators are more than up to the task, and we can probably be a model, I think, for other states and other school systems in that area as well.
Debbie, you raise a very interesting point. In our modern world, the concept of truth is often under assault in a number of ways, and expertise right along with it. And so there's a strong dilemma for us to tackle. Kate, how about you? What would you add in terms of vision for the future?
Well, I certainly would say that in the near term, I would hope that we have worked together to stabilize mental health for students and teachers as we work through this pandemic. I think keeping a healthy brain base for learning, be it cognitive and emotional, is going to be essential as we move forward and we move out of this pandemic. In terms of the long term, I think we have issues of equity that we need to deal with, certainly through funding. I have a real interest in addressing Act 173, making sure that our struggling learners have access to the highest quality teachers. We do know, I'm looking at more impact at the regional level when we worked with DMG as we built Act 173. One of the things that DMG heard that from the districts that he went into, all of them would say, or a lot of them would say, I'm so glad you came here because we do things really differently. And he actually came back and said, no, actually your similarities are far more apparent than your differences. So the ability to apply more regional resources to our districts, I think would have an effect on getting to some of our struggling learners more quickly. I'm hoping that we can stop the Act 46 distraction moving forward. Is another thing that I would hope that we can be more working together to move forward rather than dismantling.
Understood. Thank you, Kate. I would like to give a chance for Ann and Janet to respond to the same question. Janet, any thoughts you'd like to share on vision for the future of schools? I think you're muted right now, though, Janet, just so that you're aware.
That better?
There you are.
I underscore what others have said about the equity issues. If the pandemic, we knew it was a problem, but going through the pandemic and all the issues around remote learning, but not just that, also just thinking about kids whose meals are at school, whose safe places at school. There are so many issues that this has laid bare that I feel really strongly about keeping a focus on how to improve equity in education, because that's where kids are going to get it. I mean, I'm not on the education committee, but boy, this is the most important thing that we do is educate our kids, and we need to do it well, and we need to do it equitably. And I trust all of you who are working in this field to keep that in the forefront, but just understand that those of us who do the financing side are worried about it too.
We appreciate that trust, and we appreciate that work on the financial side. So thank you. And Ann, we'll come to you. We'll let you wrap up this part of our conversation.
I think we all recognize that there is financial inequity. With Act 60, we were told some towns could raise a whole lot of money on 1 cent on the tax rate, and other towns could raise almost nothing. We According to the studies we've had, straighten that out. A penny on the tax rate raises the same amount of money in every town. What we haven't dealt with is that some towns can afford to spend a penny more and other towns can't, no matter how much that money raises. And so that gets us to our general inequity, that some towns just, I mean, the school facility study just was horrifying. There are schools that many of us would not send our kids to school in. And we need to find a way to deal with that. At the bottom of that is the basic financial inequity. We have rural towns, especially, and it's a national problem, that have seen their economies, their traditional economies, go away or greatly shrink. We need to deal, at all levels. We need to deal at the economic level to bring up the economy of the state, the wages of people, to help in job retraining, to get the economy again moving in to the 21st, 22nd century. I was very disturbed. I did spend 2 whole years chairing education, and I will say it was the most educational thing I have ever done, and horrifying on some levels, to understand what was actually happening in our schools, the level of violence that was being seen, the level of mental health needs and family disruption that was being seen. And one of the things that was also disturbing is we have the highest, or one of the highest, graduation rates from high school. And we had one of the lowest, I think the second lowest, continuation to any kind of future training, not just college. I just saw a report that said we're improving in that area, which is good. But if we are going to move people into the next century or into this century, we need to make sure that that kind of future training is available in schools and post K-12, so that they can move in to the jobs that are presently out there. And it's a huge challenge, especially for a state that is small and has limited resources.
Dan, thank you very much for that perspective. At this point, we're going to end this specific part of our conversation, but our conversation is not done. We'll be turning shortly to questions from the audience, which is always fun to see what's there waiting for us. But before we do that, I'd like to go back to earlier. I want to recognize the sponsor for today's session, and that is ENA, who have supported this conference since 2013, and Nicole O'Brien from ENA, I believe, is with us now. Is this the appropriate time for that?
Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can. Hi, Nicole.
Hey, how are you? I was here earlier, you just couldn't hear me. It was a great chat with you guys today. I liked listening to everything you guys had to say. It's always interesting to learn more about what's going on at the state level. Thank you for having ENA here today. We have been working with the state of Maine and districts across the country for over 20 years now. We do everything from internet connections and Wi-Fi to reselling Zoom and Kajit products, mobile smart spots. And then more recently, we've also branched out into the software analytics space, and we have a data analytics tool called Catch On that's been getting a lot of traction with all the remote learning going on. So if you guys have any interest in exploring that a little further, getting a demo, please reach out. I believe you guys are sharing my contact information somewhere.
Sure will, yep.
That's about it. Thanks for having us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate your support of the VSBA and the VSA and of students all across the state of Vermont. So we're grateful.
Thank you.
At this point in time, we'll turn our conversation to the audience questions. Sandra Cameron with the VSBA, who's Their Director of Public Policy is going to guide us through the question and answer process. So Sandra, are you there and ready to go?
I am, thank you. I think we'll start with a question for Secretary French. Can you please speak to the involvement of teachers in the planning process for reopening schools?
Yeah, this you might be aware this issue came up with Vermont NEA in particular requested a statewide planning commission. So just to get some context on that, we had, I've lost track of time, but somewhere in April, I believe, we had the leaders of all the major education associations reach out to me and offer their support and say they'd welcome the opportunity to meet weekly in the interest of supporting that work. So that sort of informal advisory group was constituted fairly early on. Teachers were largely represented in that through their representatives, the president of Vermont NEA and the executive director of Vermont NEA. That was a continuous sort of process. And then as we were transitioning once again from that emergency response into sort of the planning, somewhere around the second week in May, we acknowledged that the focus of our planning for the fall would be the public health perspective. So we had lots of different options. People around the country were developing plans for reopening, or at least templates for plans for reopening, and we chose as a state to focus on the public health. So what we did from there was to form a task force from including some of the members of that larger advisory group, but really expanding that to include a large number of public health folks. So the goal was to really anchor our guidance in the public health science. So from there, this is pretty much shortly thereafter, and that's when the request came from Vermont NEA to constitute a state level commission. And I think it's, as you know, I rejected that request for a number of reasons. I will say that, you know, I put out an explanation as to why I rejected that, and it was largely based on a reaction to the specifics of what was being proposed in that recommendation or request. And in particular, there were a long list of items, what I would consider implementation items, that were, the vision was to create a statewide commission that would mandate essentially all the implementation aspects of schools. And there was a logic developed by Vermont NEA that basically that was too complex, or it would be very complex with 57 different supervisory unions trying to do this. So it would be helpful to have a state level planning group do that. And I didn't agree with that at all. Actually, I think there's a lot of hard work to be done that is going on right now at the district level, and there's no way to replace that sort of implementation work. So to the extent the original guidance, the health guidance in particular, was informed by teacher input, it was largely through their representatives, although we did have the president of the School Nurse Association on that as well. But turning into the implementation work, that's really where teacher, parent, student input, led, I would argue, by school boards at the local level, needs to occur now.
Thank you. This question is from our previous session, but we felt it was better asked in this session. What is the process to communicate choices to the community about a family's decision relative to enrollment for the fall? And what is the deadline for a family to select the method of enrollment for students to return to school?
I'll take that. So last week, we put out guidance on hybrid learning, which will be, as I mentioned earlier in my introductory remarks, I think where a lot of work will now go forward, in addition to implementing the health guidance. So the hybrid learning guidance that we published speaks to this issue. Firstly, is it even permissible? So what we did is we went through our regulations and to understand to what extent this is even allowed. And we concluded it is allowed because basically our regulations never anticipated pandemic or technology to a certain extent. So we concluded it is permissible. And we conclude in the second part of that guidance that there are some things to consider, since we don't necessarily have regulatory language to how to approach this issue. There's some things to consider at the district level, because I would say that in the law, it's pretty clear that school districts have a responsibility to educate their students. Unless students are being homeschooled, school districts have a responsibility to educate their students. So it's really then within the purview of the school district, meaning the school board, to decide what mode of instruction they're going to choose. And I think there's three on the table. One is in person, which is now allowable with the public health guidance. There's remote learning that's allowable, and then some combination of the two, what we're calling hybrid instruction. So how districts implement this is not clear yet. I think districts have options before them, and that's really the hard work, I think, of school boards in particular going forward, is to engage your communities in that. But it's not necessarily a parent's choice per se, unless the school board wants to delegate their policy approach to this to include parental choice. But certainly, back to the earlier comment about a state level commission, this is precisely why, in my view, a state level commission would not be fluent enough and nimble enough to navigate these issues or supplant those essential conversations between parents and their local school board. So this is going to be new ground for everyone involved. And I think, for school boards in particular, this is, their leadership is going to be critical to understanding their community's needs, understanding their infrastructure, and certainly making that assessment on what's best for students. And there's no way, in my view, to really supplant that. Arguably, we don't have a lot of time to do this work. But then again, I would say, compared to what we experienced at the first part of this emergency, 4 weeks seems like a luxury to a certain extent. We're fortunate in that regard, but we certainly acknowledge that there's a lot of work and there's a lot of complexity to it. I would just end to say, I would expect the agency to put out additional guidance in the future on this topic. Our guidance has basically had two flavors, if you will. One is more the regulatory flavor. I don't expect to put out additional regulatory guidance on hybrid learning because we've basically kicked the tires on that issue and have concluded we don't have a lot of regulatory authority other than the attendance issues that are outlined in our guidance. But the other flavor of guidance we put out are sort of considerations or best practices. So as those patterns emerge, we will be working, as we do closely with the advisory group, to understand to what extent it would be helpful to promulgate guidance from the state level on what are the best practices to implementing hybrid learning or some flavor of it.
Thank you. We'll shift to our members of the legislature for the next question. We've heard a little bit about equity within this conversation, and we're wondering, we have a question from a board member. Can you commit to implementing the weighting study, which laid out the scientific and mathematical details for bringing Vermont education financing to the level that meets constitutionality? Representative Ansel, looks like you're ready to start.
Okay, great.
So the concern with the weighting study that came up in our committee is that if we were to implement it tomorrow, there's nothing in our current system that says that money is going to go to the kids who need it. And if what we're looking for is more resources for kids in poverty and kids whose second language is English, and rural kids, there's nothing in the weighting study that says that that's going to happen. Basically, what the weighting does is it affects tax rates, and so it affects taxpayers in those districts over time, probably slowly. But it does not do anything to help the kids that we believe need assistance. So the commitment I'd make is to continue to look at ways that we can ensure that those resources go to the kids that need it. And that may not be through implementation of the weighting study, maybe some other method.
Anyone else want to comment on this question?
Well, yeah, I would say that the certainly view in Senate education is just the opposite of Representative Ansel. So it's always fun to have a little drama. I would definitely commit to implementing the weighting study, and I think Senate education definitely feels that way. We think that the study that was done is one of the best that we've ever seen, actually, and that the reasoning behind the changes that are recommended is very sound, and we are very much in support of it and would like to see it go forward.
I can say that we do have the bill from the Senate that looks at that. We did not take testimony on that at this point in time. I can say that yes, we will be looking at equity in financing of education and equity of resources. We will be looking at that. Does that mean we're going to implement that particular study? I don't know. The study is as good as the question that was asked, and the question that was asked was basically came from one district that was struggling with tax rates. So I would say it needs further question. How does it relate to our small school grants? How does it relate to Title I funding? Some of those questions were not answered. And again, to echo Representative Ansel, if we did change the funding accordingly, there's nothing that says that district can't just give it all to the taxpayers and just totally reduce tax rates. There's nothing that says that's going to the kids that need it. So these remain ongoing questions and concerns that I can say, yes, we will be looking at that. Can I say we are then going to implement the recommendations of the weighting study? I said that's to be discussed.
Thank you. I'll shift to another question. I think that this is for the legislators again. What plans are there for measuring the impact of Act 46 on cost, equity, and student achievement?
Happy to jump in on that. I probably shouldn't, but I will. I represent a town that has been very, very unhappy with Act 46, callous, no secret. And I have been put legislation in, and I've had conversations with people about the need to do an evaluation of Act 46, and I haven't gotten any traction on it. I'd love to see an effort to do an evaluation. I think it's really, really important. And I think if we're going to talk about getting people to work with Act 46 on behalf of the kids, I think we really need to do the evaluation so that people have some confidence in it. So thank you for giving me a little soapbox.
Mm-hmm.
And I would
Okay.
I would just add that you need to spend a little bit of time letting the roots grow to see what the impact is. I think 1 year plus 1 year under a global pandemic may not be. We may be measuring something, but I'm not so sure it's going to be measuring the effectiveness of Act 46. So will we be looking at that? I would imagine that we will be looking at that. Are we going to get an answer to that this year? I'd say very unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a couple things. First, I just got a low battery notice. Somehow this has gone through 50% of my iPad battery, so I may disappear. I think we always have an obligation to evaluate any major legislation that we've done, to instigate a program and say, okay, we did a program, we're out of here, and not go back. I think it is too soon to go back at this point. We've just had the court ruling that says, yeah, we can do this. We need to give school districts time, and granted, time in the middle of a pandemic is not when you really, get a chance to evaluate. But I think we do have an obligation to evaluate any major change that we do to make sure that it's doing what we wanted it to do, and adjust if it isn't.
Yeah, I echo my colleagues that we should do an evaluation, and and then of course, I mean, Act 46 is definitely one of those things where Representative Ansel's area didn't go over so well, but certainly the district that I represent, there were a lot of very positive things that came out of Act 46. So I definitely think when we do an evaluation, it will be a mixed bag.
Thank you all for your comments. This is a comment, and I'll turn it into a question at the end. With so many issues being backburnered, including equity, school evaluation, assessment, curriculum implementation, pre-K, etc., these programs and laws will simply flounder if we don't return to them. They need staffing and support. And we want to point out also that the State Board of Education would need staffing to carry out the legal mandates. Otherwise, education will be an indirect and long-term victim of the virus. Thoughts on all of getting back to all those issues that have been backburnered for now?
I guess I'll step in. Yeah, I think it's on the one hand, it's important to acknowledge those issues that have been backburnered, but I think also to acknowledge, we've had a lot of things on the table as a state, particularly as a small state, coming out of the end of No Child Left Behind Act, which arguably, was the most intrusive federal education policy in a long time, and we had 14 some odd years of that experience. And we've been given new flexibility under ESSA to do some things. But we have, I think, and the good news is we have the opportunity to act out our ideals if we have the courage to prioritize some of this work. Sometimes I think in education we've had, too many initiatives at the same time. When I started as secretary, when I'd say initiative fatigue in an audience of educators, sometimes I get a round of applause. But the initiatives, many of the ones that were just listed have a lot of merit. And we have, I think, prioritization wise, we know from the research that we have to put a priority on pre-K, for example, and we have to find a way to do that in the constraints of our current system. But those kinds of issues aren't going anywhere as much as they might be backburnered. I certainly feel the urgency to backburner some things, certainly with COVID-19. But I don't want us to shy away from some of those broader issues, because I think, especially today, I think to the author's point that education is very central to our social and economic development. And as much as we, move into recovery, if you will, of COVID-19, I think we can anticipate that our economy has been disrupted to a certain extent and needs to be adapting to these new circumstances. And education, I think, will figure prominently in those plans for the future.
So the word backburner, I think, was part of a question that got asked to us. I don't think any of us came up with that word. And the way I think I would describe those issues is really sort of thinking of a medical model, that we were doing triage. There are things that we had to do that were emergent, absolutely emergency, which is, all the consequences of closing schools and making sure that kids continued to have some connection to the school, some form of education. And as we move forward, we're the triage, we're sort of in midterm kinds of interventions, and some things, because of the situation that we're in, they're not less important or lower priority, but they're at a later period of time in order to address them. So I think I'm just reacting to the term backburner. The fact that we didn't get the school construction bill through didn't mean that it was backburnered. It meant that there were things that we had to get done before we left in June that took the time and energy, and we continue to work towards those things. So I think that would be my main comment.
I think I would add that I think the pre-K and early education is not on the back burner. I think that the global pandemic may well have pushed it to the very front burner as we're watching childcare facilities that are closing, as we're looking at the concept of 10 hours. What does that do for working family? That I think that I have a real interest in re-engaging in a conversation in light of what we've learned during this global pandemic.
Wonderful, thank you. This question is from a superintendent. In one of yesterday's keynotes, one of the presenters shared Vermont data that was focused on equity within our system. And one of the data points included a comparison between average teacher salary for high and low poverty schools. The discrepancy was staggering. I appreciate hearing our legislators talk about a focus on equity. Thank you. I do hope that work continues through Act 173 and the waiting study. Maintaining teachers and sustaining that experience to support all students would be of significant help in high poverty districts. Would you consider looking at the comparison along with the data on teacher experience level to consider finding ways to help make working in high needs and high poverty schools more attractive for teachers?
I would certainly support that. And well, and actually, I think, you know, going back to the waiting study, I mean, part of the point of that is that it actually costs more money to educate certain kinds of students, and I think that certainly in our high poverty areas and in some areas where it's more challenging to educate students and to attract educators. Again, that would be a source of money to be able to compensate them more adequately. But yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that study that you saw yesterday, and you know, it's very distressing when we hear these stories of terrible inequity, and absolutely we want to work towards making sure that our compensation levels are more equitable for our educators.
I did see that data yesterday, and one of the concerns I have is it showed the average salaries. It did not look at what the starting salary, it did not compare starting salaries. And I think that's a much more fair assessment as to what the equity is between districts in terms of salary. What is it about the salary that is attracting people? I do know, I mean, I remember pre-Act 60 moving from one district to another and, you know, getting the $6,000 pay raise just in moving from that district. That was pre-Act 60. I think that it's a matter of getting the right data, and I'm certainly willing to have that conversation.
Okay, I'm going to chime in here because I now have a red line on my power computer. I really thought I've been on since 8:30. I really thought I'd get more time on this, but I think what we're seeing here is the inequity in the economic system reflected in the schools. We're concerned that the waiting study won't go to the students who need it because the parents of the students who are paying the taxes also need it. It took me a while knocking on doors during a campaign to understand that even with the Act 60 subsidies, many families can't afford that extra $25, even though the state's paying an additional $75 of their taxes. And so we have competing needs out there. We have the same problem with teachers. The students who need the most help, the towns can afford to pay the teachers the least. On the other hand, those teacher contracts are individually negotiated, or sometimes they're, you know, supervisory union negotiated. And it has been discussed since I've been around going to a statewide teacher's contract. But to bring all those salaries up is a very expensive proposition, and it's never come to fulfillment. Just because, you know, the question is, where would the money come from? And so we have a problem. And I think we recognize it. It's the solution that's elusive.
And so it's a really good question, and it points up for me what I think the waiting study did do for us. Is it basically what it should do, it should help us identify the kinds of data that we need in order to be able to make the decisions that we need to make in order to address the equity problem and ensure that we're giving kids the best possible education that we can. I think there are a number of data points I'd like to look at sort of what what's the correlation between student spending and student outcomes, and particularly for different types of students and different types of learners? Weighting study didn't talk about that. It was purely, as Kate said, the question was asked, are the weights appropriate? And the answer was no, they're not. I'd ask the question is, are we using weighting in the most appropriate way? Is weighting predated Act 60? Is it really make sense to use it in this current funding formula, the way that we use it? And so it's a great question, and I think I would love to see us work together to figure out what data we actually ought to be asking for, and I think that's an important piece.
Thank you. I'm seeing that it's 11:45.
And I've got a red bar on mine now too.
Ah,
To the end of
we
our
made
question
it.
and answer section.
So we've kept everybody through the red bars. Mission accomplished. Thank you to our panelists today. We are incredibly grateful for your time, for your insight, for your perspective, and for your leadership that we know is coming down the road. So thank you very much for the time spent with us. And I do hope that everyone that is with us will join us for the next workshop of the conference, which will be focused on health and safety guidance for reopening schools. That workshop will begin promptly at noon, but right now I would like to turn things over to Neil Odell.
I am only here, Dave, to follow up and just tell everybody to enjoy a 15-minute break, and we will all get back together at noon for our final workshop of the morning. So thanks, folks. See you soon.